Hi everybody. Let's pick up with chapter one. This is the slide that we left our last lecture when we finished. And so this is a reminder to make sure that when you're reading your ebook and you're reading the chapters, to make sure that you do pay attention to the figures and the captions, because there's a lot of really good information in there. So I can think about 4 or 5 different kinds of questions that I could ask you from this one figure. So again, either take notes on them or just make sure that you pay attention to them as you go through them. So throughout our course, we're going to hear quite a bit about ecosystem services. And these are things that arise from just the normal functioning of these natural services, and they're the ones that allow us to be able to survive here on the planet. There's a list here. In our next chapter, chapter 2, you're going to see an actual table of them, but it's all the things that we just take for granted every day. Having clean air, clean water to breathe, or to drink, all the ways that nutrients get cycled through the system, our climate, how it gets regulated, just the pollinators pollinating the plants to make food for us. These are all kinds of different systems that are happening every day. And again, usually we don't pay that much attention to them. People can degrade these ecosystem services, and we can do that in a number of ways. We can either totally use them up and exhaust them, we can destroy their habitats, or we could infect them by our pollution as well. And the more affluent people get, meaning the more wealthy they get, this seems to intensify the damage that we have on our systems. And the increasing population growth, the more people there are, the more our systems are taxed every day. There's just more and more people here affecting things. And I wonder if you realize how many people there are on the planet. This number just keeps going up. Right now, there's a little over 7 billion. I think there's 7.2 billion people here. And this is phenomenal. Every day there's more people than has ever been here before. We are adding a tremendous number of people per day. If we look back in time, going all the way back to 10,000 years ago, the human population was very, very small. And then the agricultural revolution hit, where people realized that they could actually stay in one place and stop being hunter and gatherers, and they could grow food. They found ways of preserving food, storing food, and that was the beginning of populations going higher. There was a pretty big break. Over time, the population stayed fairly low. If you look at that little dip down back in the 1400s, and I'm going to let you think for a minute what that might have been from. So the human population actually declined enough that you can see it on this graph. So what happened in the late 1400s that killed a lot of people? Do you guys remember? You probably heard about the Black Death and the Black Plague, and that took out millions of people, especially in Europe. But still, the population stayed relatively small compared to what it is now. And then, boom, in the mid 1700s, that's when the Industrial Revolution took off. We learned how to harness fossil fuels. More and more people moved to cities to work in factories. Agricultural became much more industrialized, again, using lots of fossil fuels. There was better medicine, so less people were getting sick and dying. There was better sanitation. So all of these things really jump-started the enormous human population growth that has happened in the last, since the 1700s. So if we look at this, the graph is continuing to go up. We're expected to reach about 10 billion people by the time you guys are my age. So I'm just wondering where you think those extra 3 billion people are going to go, and all of their stuff that they have as well, right? So let's talk about their stuff. Let's talk about our ecological footprint. So this is just a graphical way of expressing how much, what we're actually using up. And so at the top of the foot, that's the percent carbon. This is the forest land that's required to be able to absorb all your CO2 emissions. That's from burning fossil fuels, driving, transporting, flying on planes, making electricity, all of those things. So about 54% of your fossil fuel use is needed for that much land. Fishing, about 4% is used for fishing and fish products. About 10% are forest products. The land that we use to build up on, whether it's cities or strip malls or transportation, that's about 2%. We need about 8% of the land for animal products. So if you like to eat meat or dairy food, then we need pastures for those animals to be grazing. And then lastly, cropland. So all the land in the country that is set up to be able to grow food for us, that accounts for about 8%. So if we look at this total footprint, and this is a footprint for somebody who lives in the United States, if we look for that, basically we are using up our renewable resources about 50% faster than they're being replenished, and that's really scary. It means, so for those of you who have a job or you have some money in your bank account, it would mean that your expenses every week are double what you have available. And you can do the math. It does not take you very long until you've run out of your money. And that's sort of what we're saying here with these resources, is that we are running through these renewable resources, and that's with the current population the way it is now. That doesn't account for the extra people that are being born every day. So within your chapter, you can read a little bit about Easter Island. This is a semi-mysterious civilization that we know used to exist because they left behind these giant statues. So we know that somebody carved them and left them. And there's a lot of controversy about what may have happened to those people. And this is not the only civilization that doesn't exist anymore. At some point in time, there were thousands of people there on Easter Island, and now there are none. This is not unsimilar to some of the things that happened in the Middle East and even in South America as well. So let's look at environmental science as a science, and it is interdisciplinary, and these are all of the various different sciences and disciplines that are linked into environmental science. So I don't know what all your majors are, but I'm sure if you look through this list of these, you are going to find somewhere where you can see how your background, or even if you're an educator, you want to be a teacher, how all of that is going to link into environmental science. And so now real quickly, let's talk about what science is. So, science is just the way that we learn about the world and the way that we test things and we understand things. And the interesting thing about science is it's always changing. It's never the same. So things that you might have learned in grade school, those ideas might have been changed and modified. That doesn't mean that the things that you learned earlier were incorrect. It just means that through more scientific investigation, better technology, better instrumentation, we constantly are learning and changing and discovering new things. Scientists often really help develop the useful applications that we all use, and they help us to understand how the world works. If we look at some of the applications of science, for instance, we see here is a Chevy Volt. That's an electric hybrid car. The engineers used a tremendous amount of science to figure out how to make all the systems in that car work. And so there were scientists developing batteries and new ways of things working together, and then the engineers put all of it together. So that would be an application of science. Over on the right-hand side photo, you see a Forest Service person, and they are actually starting a fire on purpose. They are doing something called prescribed burning. So when there's a lot of dead plants or underbrush, like in this photograph, and there's a risk of a big wildfire coming through and really hurting the large trees, the big forest trees, they might on purpose go in and start a fire like this. And so everything about burning a forest really is based in forestry and in science. We know when do these forests need to burn. That's based on the kind of plants that are there and the condition of them. We know what day and time to even start these fires. A lot of that has to do with the weather, right? Is it too wet, too dry? Is it too windy? Is a storm expected? So all of those things are used when we figure out the policies that we're going to use to manage our natural world with. It's again all based in science. So science tests these ideas by critically examining evidence. And everyone can be a scientist. You just have to be really good at recognizing things and making observations. It's about trying to, look at things, trying to ask questions. People who are very curious, or they just see something odd, a phenomenon they're not exactly unsure, they're not exactly sure what they're seeing and how it works. Those make some of the very best scientists. So all of you in your life can be a scientist. You just have to ask a question. So asking a question, that's the same thing as a hypothesis. So once you've seen something and you're trying to understand it, you may ask a targeted kind of question. You may design even an experiment around that particular question. And then we're going to follow something called the scientific method. Now, I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time on this because a lot of you have had this in the past. If you've ever taken another science course, you probably went over this. If you've ever competed in a science fair, you've probably followed the scientific method, or if you've written a lab report, this is what you do. And so I do want to talk a little bit about what happens here as you go through the scientific method. So the hypothesis is going to basically be an educated guess. What do you think is happening? Whatever it is that you saw, what are your possible ideas to explain that? And so that generates predictions, and then we design experiments to test those particular predictions that you've made. And that's really what an experiment is. You're conducting an experiment to try to figure out if your hypothesis was correct or not. Almost always, the hypothesis, at least the first several of them, ends up becoming not correct. You have to, quote, reject the hypothesis. But you've learned something, right? So you did an experiment, and while you were doing the experiment, you observed something else. You were like, oh, well, that wasn't quite right, but what if we do this? And so that's really science on a daily basis. Almost always the hypotheses are rejected, and you have to formulate a new one. And this goes around and around and around. The results are eventually shared with people, and they're shared within the scientific community. Anybody that follows your methods, follows your experiments, should be able to get the same result that you do as well. So let's look at this photograph first off. So what is this person doing? So this is a coral reef, and they have mounted a camera on something that we would call a quadrat, which is, it looks like it's about maybe 1 meter by 1 meter square, and they're just mapping and measuring and taking samples of this coral reef. All of the coral that you see in that picture that's white, that coral is all dead. And so maybe what they're doing is they're going through this coral reef and actually collecting data about what percentage is alive, what percentage is dead. The parts that's dead, are they on the edge of the coral reef? Are they associated with something else nearby? They might be collecting temperature and light data as well. So all of this is an experiment that you're seeing here. Lots of times experiments involve manipulating a variable. So in the case of this, since they're checking out this one coral reef, they might then go to a different coral reef that's experiencing the same kind of dieback that maybe is in a little bit different water. Maybe the water quality is better there than it is here, or the temperature is different, or the light's different, or something like that. And so that would be a way of manipulating the variable. People do this a lot if they're doing like a little science project, right? If we're growing plants, you might manipulate the amount of water that some of them get or the amount of light. The data that you collect is actually basically your observations. It oftentimes is numerical. So you're maybe measuring a percent growth or something else that you can put a number to, but that's not always the case. Sometimes, especially if you're doing observational data on maybe animal behavior, it might be your written notes, right? It might not be something that you went out and measured. At this point in time, you do something called data analysis. Almost everybody in our class eventually is probably going to take statistics. Even if you are like math phobic and you do not want to take math, I would suggest all of you take Stats 261. Statistics make the world go round. It's used every day in your daily lives, and it's certainly used in science to help us analyze that data and make sense of what we find out. Usually experiments are repeated over and over again to make sure that things are proper. Eventually, you will write a paper, or maybe you will give a presentation of your results to peers, to other scientists that are in your area. They are our best critics. They are going to look closely at your work. They're going to poke holes in it. They're going to see if anything that you have come up with. Maybe it's new and exciting and they're on board, or possibly they're going to try to say, well, if you would have done this, would you have gotten the same results? Lots of times this information is shared at conferences. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes it is actually published in journals, and then people read it online, or read it in a journal they've subscribed to. Generally, people who are interested in the same field will be reading those papers, and they are our peers, they are our experts, and they're the ones who judge your work. Grants and funding to pay for all of this work can come from private or government sources. There is intense competition to get these grants, and it really requires people to do their very best work. And so science is kind of a self-regulating group. If somebody puts papers out that are not very well done, the word will get out and they probably won't be funded in the future. I did mention that things have to be repeatable. So anybody should be able to follow your exact methods and get the same answer. If they didn't, then there's something wrong, right? Something did not go right with a scientific method as much as we thought. So I have a little thing about following the money. And let's say that you are a research scientist and you're wanting to study how chemicals are released into the lakes by pulp and paper mills. You have not been able to get any funding so far. And then a very large company comes to you and says, hey, I will totally fund your research If you could examine how what we're discharging is affecting that water. And so it's sort of like a dream come true, but I want you to stop and think a minute about what are the benefits and the drawbacks to this offer. Would you take the money? What do you think might happen? Depends on what you find, right? Would you accept the offer? Again, remember, you have to do the science independently. You have to be able to publish and share your data and information with the scientific world. Do you think that taking money from a company could cause you any problems down the road? I'm going to just let you think about that for a minute. Think about if, in case, and this is an environmental example, but if we look in the healthcare field, right, there's people who, lots of times the big pharmaceutical companies, they are the ones that are paying the doctors to do clinical trials. The drug manufacturers are the ones who are paying for all of those experiments and all that research. I'm wondering what you think about that. Is that really the best way to fund our science? Do you see any problems down the road that might happen? I'm thinking you can think of some things pretty quickly that might be an issue, right? So let's talk a little bit about what a theory is. So a theory is really a very well tested and accepted explanation of something. And so people sometimes use that word theory. I don't know, they just use it as a regular word, like, oh, I theorize that, it's going to rain today. That's a different way of using that word. If we're using the theory as part of the scientific method, that's a big concept. So that means that all of the research that's been done to date, all the experiments that have been done to date, all the hypotheses and the related hypotheses, they all fit together and to make a theory. So one of the examples that you might have heard of before is Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. You might have heard of the theory of relativity. If anybody can find a single exception that does not fit a theory, then that theory has to be thrown out and revised. And so that's why there are not very many scientific theories out there, because in the natural world, there's lots of times there's exceptions to things. So theory of gravity, there's quite a few that you probably have heard about before. Here's a great word for you. The word paradigm. And the paradigm is just the dominant view. And so, for instance, back in the day, a lot of people thought that the world was flat, the earth was flat. And that's what everybody thought. And if you didn't think that, you were considered to be, not quite right. You were a crackpot. You didn't know what you were talking about. And then slowly over the time, a new view replaced the old. Another old idea was that the earth was the center of the universe, not the sun. And the earth is everything orbited around the earth. But through scientific understanding and better education, we know now that that old view was replaced with a new idea, a new understanding about the way the universe works. That's called a paradigm shift. So when an old idea is replaced by a newer idea, that's called a paradigm shift. These sometimes are very slow to happen. People think that the things that they learned from their parents, the things that they learned when they were in school, that's the way it is. And when you try to influence or explain or educate people down the road that, oh, well, this is what we used to think, but now we know this happens. It's slow to get people to come on board. They're very resistant oftentimes to changing their mind. So something that's happening now is, I have the term global warming here, but what I really want to say is climate change. Climate change is real, and it's happening now. to get people to come on board with that in the United States has been very slow. People in the rest of the world already know that climate change is absolutely real and it's happening right now, and they are just amazed that in the United States that we're still having that discussion. And again, sometimes it is very hard, it takes a long time, maybe a decade or more, decades to make that shift. Once we do, then lots of people will come on board and hopefully we'll have time to still fix things. Let's talk a little bit about environmental ethics. And so this is the idea that there's a set of moral principles or values that you as a person have, and it tells you how you think you ought to behave. So there's a couple of categories of this. There's relativists and there's universalists. That's a very hard word for me to say. If you're a relativist, that just means that your ethics vary within the social context. So maybe things that you might say or do with your friends would be very different than things that you might say or do if your parents were there, right? If you are a universalist, that means that what is right and what is wrong is the same. It doesn't matter what culture you're in, what situation you're in, things are either right or wrong. And I want you guys to think about those two and think about yourselves for a minute and see if you can figure out which category you would fall into. I think a lot of us would like to say that we're in the bottom category, that we know what's right and what's wrong, and that's the way we behave all the time. But that's saying basically that everything's black and white and there's no shades of gray. And you and I probably know that there oftentimes are some exceptions to things where maybe it's okay to tell a little white lie if it makes somebody else feel good, to keep somebody's feelings from getting hurt or something like that. So you kind of have to think here about what you are. So there are these ethical standards, and these are basically the criteria that you kind of automatically think about when you try to decide what is right and what is wrong. So there's the example, the quote golden rule, that we want to treat others as we want to be treated, and pretty much that's the way I've grown up. That's what I strive for. I try never to say or do anything to anybody that I wouldn't want them to do to me. And I think that's kind of a good rule of thumb, a way of treating people. There's also this example called the principle of utility. And it says that something is right when it produces the greatest practical benefit for the most people. And so something that's utilitarian means that it's useful. And so that's how you're supposed to decide what is right and what is wrong. If it benefits the most people, then that must be the right thing to do. So, here are some questions about environmental ethics that sometimes these are really difficult to discuss. Is it okay to destroy a forest if we create jobs for people? Is it okay for some communities to be exposed to excess pollution? That's where they live, and is it okay to pollute that area? Should we try to conserve resources for your children and your grandchildren? So that means that you get to use less if we're conserving them for other people. Is it okay to drive other species to extinction? That's a big question for our class. How important is biodiversity and other organisms? So these are some of the kinds of questions that you might ask as we go through our semester and talk about the environment a little bit. So there are 3 different ethical perspectives. They show them here, starting from a little box going up to a larger box. And so let's go through these. And as I explain them to you, I want you to think about what you actually are. So anthropocentrism is that only humans have rights. The cost and benefits of something should only, the measurement of those is basically by how they impact people. So only people should be considered here. Anything not providing a direct benefit to people really has no value. Okay, and so that's what somebody feels if they're anthropocentric, is that it's all about the people. If you're if you're biocentric, this means that certain living things have value. All life, everything that's alive, human and non-humans, all have some kind of ethical standing that should be considered. People who feel like this might oppose a development or a new road or something like that if it destroys life, even if it would benefit people, right? So even if it might increase food or food production or provide more jobs and economic growth or more housing, even if that were the case, they still might oppose development if it was going to kill things or somehow hurt other organisms. And the last one is called an ecocentric or ecocentrism. And these people feel that the whole system, the whole ecological system has value. Values, everything within the ecosystem, the communities, the species, all of them should be protected, and they all have value. It preserves connections between all the different members and organisms of that community and ecosystem. And so I'm wondering right now what all you are. So if you have to stop back and really think about what you feel, which one do you fall into? And my other question for you is, how many of you eat meat? Are you guys meat eaters? So if you are a meat eater, then which one of these are you sort of automatically fall into if you're a meat eater? So you really can't be biocentric, right, if you eat meat. This is saying that you would oppose things that would destroy life. And if you are eating animals, that means that they've had to be killed. And so you probably are not really biocentric if you are a meat eater. I wish I didn't like to eat meat, but I am a meat eater. I was a vegetarian for a little while. I think if I had to go and kill my own meat and I had to go out and do that, I would probably be a vegetarian. I think a lot of people might be in that group too. So I guess because I do eat meat, then that puts me back into this group here, because I'm putting my rights, my human rights over that of the animals that I'm killing to eat. So I don't like to think of myself this way. What I really would love to be is to be able to think of myself this way. But maybe I am ecocentric because I feel really, really guilty about animals that I eat. I feel bad for them that they had to be killed and that I'm eating them, but I still keep doing it. So I don't know which one I actually fall into. I guess maybe if you feel guilty enough, maybe you're biocentric or ecocentric, but I want you to think about that a little bit. So let's look at this old-timey photo here. And one of these people is President Roosevelt, and the other is John Muir. You might have seen a picture of one or both of them before. John Muir is the one with the big beard, and President Roosevelt is there on your left. They really brought this notion of preservation to the United States way back in the late 1900s. The early 1900s, they wanted to preserve nature. They said that it has its own inherent value and we should protect our environment and keep it in a pristine, unaltered state. So that word pristine means, sort of clean, untouched, not polluted or contaminated, that they wanted to be things to be left alone. President Roosevelt and John Muir are given credit for basically helping to start the national park system in the United States, including Yellowstone, which is where they're standing at, and they are visiting there. So other folks have come into play. Back in the 20th century, this is Gifford Pinchot. I actually work with his granddaughter on some restoration projects right now. They said, wait a minute, we need to conserve things. We don't want to preserve and just set them aside. We need to start using our natural resources wisely. And so they had this utilitarian viewpoint that resources should be used, but we're interested in what's the greatest good for the most people for the longest time. And he was very anthropocentric, about what would be useful for people. He was the first person to direct the U.S. Forest Service, and so he was kind of responsible for that. And so that was his idea, is that things needed to be conserved, but we needed to be more sustainable about the way we use our resources. In chapter 1, there's a section I would really like you to read, and it kind of talks a little bit more in detail about these three people. One of the most interesting stories that I didn't know about until I read your book is about Aldo Leopold, and I actually know who he was. He ended up being a famous ecologist at University of Wisconsin. He didn't start out that way. He actually worked for the Forest Service. He actually worked for some of the Park Service. And one of his earliest jobs that he did, even though he loved nature, was to kill wolves and to try to kill as many wolves as they can. And then he had this very unusual encounter with a wolf. And it dramatically changed him, like overnight, the way he thought about things. And so I want you to read that little section that's in your book. It's really interesting to see what happened to him. And so basically he came up with this idea about a land ethic. And he said that having a healthy ecological systems depends on protecting all the parts. We need everything to be left alone. We are actually obligated as people to treat this land ethically. And so he was the first person that actually called for people to view themselves as the land as part of the same community, to view us as being interconnected to each other. Environmental justice is a fairly new concept in the environment. It's certainly not a new concept in the world, but it is in environmental science. This is saying that there should be fair treatment of all people with respect to the environment, regardless of their income, their race, or their ethnicity. So if you see these little kids here, they're obviously playing with some debris. It does not look like a very safe place or neighborhood for little kids like this to be playing. You can see bags of garbage all over. I wish this was a unique photo, but it is not. In almost every town that you've ever or city that you've ever been through, there's usually part of that area that kind of looks like this. There's a lot of debris. Sometimes there's a lot of pollution in that area. The houses are sort of run down. Lots of the people here are living in poverty. And the concept of environmental justice is that everybody should have a clean, healthy environment. And it shouldn't matter whether they are black, white, brown, red, whatever they might be, or how wealthy they are, how poor they are. Everybody should have a clean environment. Working towards that is this idea about sustainability. And sustainability just says that we are wanting to live within our planet's means. you need and I need to leave the earth conserving resources for all the generations to come. Your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. We want to develop solutions that are going to work in the long term. We want to keep fully functioning ecological systems. They need to stay intact and functioning. And so sustainability is really the guiding principle for modern environmental science. Everything that we're studying these days and looking at is based in sustainability. How sustainable are those ideas and what we're doing? If we look back at the earth sort of being like all of these natural resources, if we look at them sort of like a bank account, the idea here is that we need to leave the principal intact and just spend a little bit of the interest. When we deplete the principal, those ecosystems, we are decreasing that bank account, and it may never go back up. And I mentioned to you when I showed you the footprint earlier, we are currently using the Earth's natural capital about 50% faster than it can be renewed or produced. And so we cannot do that for very long, especially with more and more people being born every day. We're kind of almost at the tipping point where we need to really stop and think about what we're doing. The more people there are, the greater that we affect the planet. So there's about 200,000 new people being born every day. We are using more and more resources every day. Our lives for a lot of us are very pleasant. We have air conditioning, we have heat, we have food, we have medicine, we have so many things that we could go and buy. We don't even have to go anywhere. We just get on our computers and order things and they magically appear at our doors. So all of this has led to something, our consumption is much higher. If we were all face to face, I would have you guys show your hands, and I want you to think for a minute about your shoes. How many different pairs of shoes do you own? And so if you're away at college and you're not living at home or you're in an apartment, think back to when you were living at home and in your closet. How many different pairs of shoes do you own? And I'm going to start the number off with how many of you have more than 10 pairs of shoes. That includes flip-flops, that includes sandals, boots, tennis shoes, running shoes, any kind of footwear. How many of you have more than 10 pair? I'm guessing most of you are going, yeah, I probably do, especially if you live in different kind of climates, right? So in Ohio, we have, our winter footwear, and then we have our summer footwear. And then I'm going to say, how many of you have more than 20 pairs of shoes? Some people really like shoes, and they have lots of different colors and lots of different kinds. And you guys luckily can't see my hand, but my hand is up. And then I'm going to say how many of you have more than 30 pairs of shoes. And then a lot of people's hands are going to go down. But I'm guessing that a few people, including myself, we have that many shoes. So my shoe size hasn't changed for the last 20 plus years. And so I have so many shoes, I rarely wear out a pair. And why do I keep buying them? That is called affluenza. So this increased affluence here, I see them, I like them, I think, oh, those are nice, that's a pretty color, or oh, that's neat. And so then I buy more things. Not that I need them. I already have way more shoes than I can possibly wear out in my lifetime. But that's the problem with being affluent, is we continue to buy things. And there is a huge gap in the world between very, very rich people and very, very poor people. And I know a lot of you might think that you're not rich, but compared to people in the world who don't even have a home, they are living maybe under a piece of cardboard, they don't even own a pair of shoes, they never have had a pair of shoes, their kids don't have any shoes. Compared to them, you are rich. And so
My goal for you is for the rest of our class, for the next few weeks, why don't you try really, really hard not to buy anything unless you absolutely need it? Because every time you buy something, a lot of the world's resources went into making that. And so let's see if anybody can make it the whole semester without buying anything new. I'm not talking about food because, you use the food up, but I'm talking about stuff. Let's see if you could maybe go the rest of the semester without maybe ordering more stuff on Amazon or buying more stuff. Some of you won't be even able to last a day. You'll probably be buying something tonight or tomorrow. But let's think about that for the rest of our semester and about how we're going to be more sustainable. The last figure in this chapter shows sort of the ecological footprints here of all kinds of different countries. And that HA, you guys, means hectares. And so that's a metric unit for area. A hectare is about 2.5 acres. And so this is saying that people in the United States, look at the size of our footprint. The closest one to us is Canada. That's how much land we need, about 7.2 hectares, to be able to support our life. The world average is about 2.7 hectares. People down in Rwanda and India are using less than 1 hectare. And so this is just a graphical way of representing all of the population and consumption that we do. How much land does it actually take to support us? So I think that's kind of an interesting figure. And so you guys look at it. I'm guessing that Chinese footprint there is going up. I'm guessing that's going up and up and up because more and more people from China are flying. And when you do fly, you use a tremendous amount of resources. All right, so that is the end of chapter 1. The things that you have left to do, you should do all the homework for chapter 1. You should take the online quiz for chapter 1. And don't forget that there are study guide questions. Those study guide questions are from this lecture directly, and you might pull them open and see if you can go back and just try to answer them from after you've listened to this lecture. You will find those study guide questions on your exams as written questions, short answer and essay type questions. So for each chapter, I will give you those things. So you're going to get a copy of the PowerPoint slides. You're going to get me going over the slides with you as a video. You are going to have homework from your mastering. You're going to have a quiz. And then lastly, I'll give you a study guide to help you get ready for the test. What you don't want to do is ignore those study guides and just wait till it's time for an exam. It's way, way, way faster if you just work on them right now because you've just listened to this lecture and you probably know a lot of the answers right now. One of my other students, instead of taking a lot of notes, they actually start and stop these recordings and answer the study guide questions as we go through them. And maybe that's a good use of your time too. That way it's more of an active kind of learning. All right, everybody get in touch with me if you have any questions, and looking forward to a good semester with you. And next week we'll work on chapter 2. Okay, bye-bye.